Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CARE webinar titled Cognition in Art Education. On behalf of NIE CARE, and CARE stands for the Center for Arts Education in Research, Research in Education, a warm welcome to one and all. The NIE Center for Arts Research in Education, CARE for short, is the research hub of the Visual and Performing Arts academic group at the National Institute of Education, Singapore. CARE is also a signatory member of the UNESCO UNITWIN International Network of Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development. My name is Lim Kok Boon, a master teacher from the Singapore Teachers Academy for the Arts. I'll be your moderator for this webinar. It brings me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Rebecca Heaton is an assistant professor in Visual and Performing Arts Education. Prior to working at NIE, Rebecca was a senior lecturer in education at a UK university. She completed her Ed.D. in art education at Cambridge University and is a qualified teacher. Her research interests include the arts and creativities in education, cognition, technology, and social justice. Before we begin, I want to mention and to encourage attendees to post questions using the chat function. As the presentation progresses, we will look out for your questions and consolidate and take them at the end during the Q&A segment. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Heaton. Over to Zhu.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Rebecca Heaton. I'm an assistant professor here in Visual and Performing Arts at NIE, and I'm going to speak today about cognition in art education. Just so you have a little bit of background about who I am, I trained as a primary school teacher, and I was a subject specialist for art in the primary school. I then went on to do my master's and took a job as a senior lecturer in art education in the UK, and I've now moved over here to Singapore with my family. So, to think about cognition in art education, I'd like us to first think about why do we need to consider the role and the importance of cognition. Cognition is fundamentally how we learn, how we generate knowledge, and how we come to know. With changing times, it's important to stay up to date with how cognition is created in art education as a subject. Art education is being marginalised internationally across educational sectors. So considering the role cognition plays in our subject can actually make a contribution to reinstating the subject's worth. Increasingly, educators are being asked to show impact and to be accountable for the learning that happens in the subjects that we teach. So to do that, we need to make it clear across policy, practice and research how learning occurs in our subject, particularly when in a subject like art, our cognitive contributions are not just scientific, they're actually effective, they're embodied. In essence, we need to change the conversation about how cognition is considered. It often gets associated with the sciences, and art is actually deemed to make an unscientific contribution, but that's actually untrue. Art is actually very powerful. When we think about art cognitively, we're actually embracing our way of living. We're making connections between different contexts, our experiences, the people that we meet, and the art that we actually produce. So the aims of this webinar are to discuss a number of things. So first of all, I'd like to unpick and demonstrate what cognition is in art education. I'd like to share the complexities of cognition in art education. I'm also going to present today a research framework that I devised to assist access to cognition in art education. I'm going to make some recommendations to support the reinstatement of cognition across policy, practice and research. And then at the end, we'll engage in some questions and discussion to hear your views about cognition in art education. Through this webinar, I'd like it to be quite interactive. So I actually have an audience task for you. So during the webinar, it would be really useful for me if you could actually draw your contributions. Think about what cognition means to you in art education and you can doodle, you can journal on a piece of paper, writing down, adding pictures, basically producing a small piece that you're happy to share at the end onto the Padlet that I've put onto the screen here. And then at the end of this webinar, we can have a look at all of the contributions people have made. If you do contribute, then it may be that we use your contribution in future for research or publication purposes. So if you're not happy for that to occur, then please don't share your final product. Okay, so let's think first about what cognition actually is in art education. So cognition is actually present in all aspects of life and learning. There are many educators out there who I know are already providing rich and deep cognitive experiences for their learners in art education, and they're doing this both knowingly and unknowingly. So, for example, a recent school that I've been engaging with, they actually were dealing with pandemic pressures. They wanted to keep their art education thriving, so they actually invited a group of artists, illustrators, to actually work with the school and their families, and actually conduct webinars a little bit like this, to share art practice and the lives and experiences of the artists and the illustrators, engaging the children and their families in practical art education activities online through home-based learning. That's actually a really rich experience that enables children and their families to build cognition around art education together. Cognition is unique to individuals. It occurs consciously and subconsciously. It actually involves mapping, us making connections in our brain, with our body, with our minds. It involves us inquiring, making, reflecting, and teaching. And in such, it's incredibly complex because we're uniting so many different components of our existence together. Cognition involves a response to environments, to times, to people, and it's fundamentally a way of learning. In art education, cognition actually brings together psychology, it brings together cognitive science, it brings together art, technology, history, to name some examples. And in essence, through that, we actually have an interdisciplinary experience where we're starting to build connections in order to know, where we take aspects from different parts of our life to build a cognitive understanding. So our cognition is actually developing all of the time. It's happening whilst we're being, whilst we're existing, whilst we're living. So that's why it can be actually quite hard to document cognition. So to help us in order to understand cognition a little bit more, we can think about historical models of cognition. And there's been some really lovely theoretical models in art education that have been developed to help us engage with learning and cognition in our subject. So Hetland and colleagues in 2007 actually developed the studio habits of mind. And this group of strategies and dispositions is actually used quite frequently in art education classrooms, where we're actually encouraging the children to express, to reflect, to develop craft, and it underpins a lot of educational curriculums in art. So these habits of mind are actually cognitive dispositions, and when students engage with each of these habits of mind, they're actually forming connections. These connections don't actually go round in a circle, as you can see on the model here. The connections are much more fluid. We might be moving, when we're making, we might be moving from expressing an idea to trialing a technique in art education, to reflecting on that technique, going through a process of trial and error, changing things, doing things differently. And as we're doing that, it perhaps helps us to understand our arts community. We may have visited an exhibition recently, and we put those ideas into the product or the process that we're engaging in to make something. So we're actually switching between different studio habits of mind, and that helps us to build cognitive connections. So one way of thinking about cognition could be to actually take a theoretical model in art education and then use it to think about how connections are actually formed. And we often actually do that with our art education students who are in teacher training or doing master's level studies. And you can see that in practice in the image on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can actually see examples of students working sketchbooks, students making in the studio spaces, projecting things online through the internet, visiting galleries like the Tate Gallery in London, for example, here. And actually, through all these different experiences, they're engaging in the studio habits of mind and therefore building their cognition and their cognitive dispositions. And that's how the learning actually occurs. So in relation to Critchfield's work in 2014, he actually suggested that cognition actually involves the mind, the body, and our situated context. So the experiences that we have, the situations that we find ourselves in, actually help us to develop our cognition within art education. So cognition is actually an embodied experience. So to give you a little bit of a brief history of cognition in art education, I put a number of quotations onto this slide for you from quite influential academics in the field of art education. So in the literature in art education, cognition is actually defined and largely accepted as a facet of the conscious and the unconscious mind. Two key figures, Elliot Eisner and Kevin Tavin, have actually written a lot about the cognition in art education being a conscious and an unconscious entity. It's also a practice that's fueled by knowledge and research, by mapping and inquiry, and it's an infiltrator to change. Gert Biester in 2017 wrote a lot about how we actually dialogue with our world, and actually cognition is created through that dialogue with the world. And it's important in art education that that dialogue remains relevant and up to date, and that it changes. Children in 20 years' time are going to be experiencing a different environment to we are now. So through their art education, they can actually start to question, think about the future that they're going to be exposed to, and actually dialogue with the now and with the future, as well as with the past. So most notably, scholars like Elliot Eisner, Michael Parson, Charles Dorn, Arthur Efland, Graham Sullivan, Karen Tavin, Nicole Ganesta, they've actually all forged a space for cognitive study in art education. So it might actually sound like cognition in art education has actually been well studied. Actually, that's only quite a small contribution to in relation to the way that cognition has been studied across other subjects within education. Often it's difficult within art education to gain funding for research into cognition as a field because art education as a subject, as I mentioned earlier, is often marginalized. Other studies which I reference in this space here actually contribute to the research space surrounding cognition's concept and its contribution to art education. So if we look at a couple that are here up on the screen, cognition is actually a tool for mental processing. So it may be that through our artwork, we're actually engaging with thoughts in our mind. Quite often, I'm driving my car and then I have to stop and pull over and jot down things in a journal as ideas come to me. So this mental processing doesn't just happen in classrooms for art education. Our ideas expand and develop beyond the classroom space. Cognition is actually computational. The brain solves problems and it uses symbolism to actually generate different behaviors. So art actually becomes our voice. It becomes a cognitive voice for us to express our ideas. Cognition is also a form of connectionism, where we start to join ideas together, and it's actually a means to curate learning. So I actually developed the term curating cognition, which is similar to a term used when you're curating an exhibition. When you create an exhibition, you put work up onto the wall around you or in the exhibition space, and you're making conscious decisions, taking responsibility for how it's going to be organized. When you create cognition as a means to develop learning, you actually think about the cognitive decisions that you're making, and you can take some responsibility of those as educators to actually push your cognition forward. So it might be that you're consciously making the decision to go to exhibitions in order to develop your practice. It may be that you want to be exposed to a range of different types of artist work. You want to read papers in a particular research area, and you can actually help yourself to move your cognition forward and actually take responsibility for it. And that tends to happen more as we get older, as we become more experienced in art education as a subject. But doing that can actually help us to understand more about how our children that we may be teaching are actually learning and creating their cognition. And they can actually do that too. Okay, so what should we be actually striving for in terms of cognition in art education? So I've got two images on the screen here to help explain some ideas. So if we take the first image, I actually think that art education experiences need to be exciting. They need to engage students. They need to ignite their curiosity. They need to be playful. They need to allow for trial and error. And in doing so, they actually facilitate a space for world dialoguing, for looking at things from different perspectives, so that we can hear different opinions in order to build more comprehensive artworks and hopefully a better future. If we think about this in relation to Brent Wilson's 2020 article that he wrote for the Encyclopedia of Art Education, he actually talked about how children engage with their visual cultures from a child-initiated perspective, an adult-initiated perspective, and also in a collaborative space. So a child-initiated space might be a child who's perhaps freely playing in their house. They might be playing with art materials, but equally they might be playing with something like Lego. And that they've initiated their response, but they're still engaged in actually making and thinking about different ideas and connecting them together. A more adult-initiated space might be something like a traditional classroom for art education, where the adult has actually set this space up. It could also be a museum or a gallery setting, but the adult's taken ownership for that space. And in that space, the students can actually devise problems. They investigate perhaps provocations that the adult has actually set up. And the art classrooms preserve and maintain world art and a shared visual cultural heritage. But it can be difficult because it's hard for schools to actually catch up with visual culture. So obviously, sometimes we actually see a disconnect between what schools can achieve and what's actually going on around us in children's visual culture. The third space is actually about a collaborative space. So that could be a collaborative space online where people are perhaps talking about artworks over the internet. It could also be a collaborative space that's been set up in a classroom where children are kind of solving problems and they're working together in order to reach an answer or an artwork, for example. So when we're thinking about collaborative spaces, our entry into those collaborations is usually voluntary. So we have our own autonomy and ownership in order to engage in them. If we have a look at image 2, that also helps us to think about what we're striving for in terms of cognition in art education. So image 2 actually shows lots of connections. This is actually an artwork that I created as part of my doctoral study to model what cognition is in an interdisciplinary way. But actually within the art classroom, what we're trying to see is actually deep learning through art education experiences. We're trying to get children and young people and adults who are engaged in art education to actually build connections, to connect with different people, to have interdisciplinary experiences, to collaborate, to revisit concepts and ideas, to scaffold, to move forward. And while they're engaged in all of those different acts, they're actually building this network of cognitive connections that actually helps us to learn. Okay, so let's have a think about how cognition actually develops in art education. So if we have a look at the 4 squares that I've put on the screen here, you can actually see that cognition's built in social cultural spaces. So those social cultural spaces might actually be the gallery space, it might be the classroom space, it might be through the dialogic engagement that we're having online. Cognition actually can be also developed through analytical thinking and through our visual processing. So perhaps where we're working in a sketchbook in order to develop ideas and we're processing our visual thoughts, through that progress we're actually building our cognition. So what can we actually do as art educators to facilitate this development of cognition? The bubble on the right-hand side gives us some ideas. We can actually sort of encourage children to make crossovers and connections, talking about entities that happen in one aspect of their art education and relating them to another. Or even going beyond art education as a subject and perhaps thinking about how science or maths or technology actually connects back to the art experience that they're having, so that their connections that they're building are actually transformative and actually helping them to develop depth. We can also get children to think about their identities as artists, and adults as well, to think about how their identity is evolving as they're learning and generating different cognitive connections. I want to draw on Marit Dewhurst's work. She's an associate professor of art education in New York. And she actually talks about how in order to develop cognition, we actually need active art experiences for learners. That we can encourage learners to engage in social justice art education, to actually dialogue with their time, to think about the problems that are happening around them and actually respond to them and the current issues through their artwork. And in doing that, they actually would develop cognitive competencies. So they're actually engaging in meaningful art practices, as Parsons mentioned in 2005. The process and product of art and actually building cognitive connections through art actually helps us to learn and develop our cognitive intelligences. So if I think about the work of Howard Gardner, he actually suggests there's 11 different types of intelligences that we use within the educational experience. And all of those 11 intelligences can actually be connected to and applied within art education as well. And they help us to build our cognition. So you can actually start to see here now that when we're developing cognition, it's actually a very holistic thing. It's a very embodied experience. And it's actually quite difficult to define what cognition actually is. So I want to talk next about some of the complexities associated with cognition in art education. So if cognition is so present, as we've seen in some of the examples that I've shared with you previously in our subject, why is there actually limited engagement with cognition in our discipline? And when I mean limited engagement, I'm talking about real explicit engagement with cognition as a field. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One of those is actually associated with dissonance. So first of all, in relation to dissonance, so many different forms of cognition are discussed in education and art education as well. You may have heard terms like transcognition, miscognition, metacognition, thinking about thinking, paradigmatic cognition, embodied cognition, to name some of those terms. And that actually makes the complex nature of cognition extremely challenging to grapple with and to engage with. Cognition is also very individual. so it's hard to articulate and demonstrate how cognition occurs. For example, how our past experiences, our biological makeup actually contribute to our cognitive developments that occur. Cognition may also look different to different people. So the cognitive experiences that I've had would be very different to one of my colleagues. Because we've engaged with different art education settings, we perhaps worked in different schools, so our cognition actually grows and develops and manifests in different ways. And that's exactly the same for children. They have different home lives, and they may be taking different things from the art education that they're experiencing in their schools, and when they start to connect them together, they actually build their own cognition, and we call that developing their connectomy. Another complexity that actually causes dissonance is about the transfer of cognition. It can actually be challenging because if teachers are struggling to conceptualize themselves what cognition is and how it occurs in learning, then how can children be expected to comprehend what cognition is and how it develops? I've recently conducted a piece of research into conceptions of cognition with 3 academics who are based in Singapore and in the UK. And actually, when they were engaging with the term cognition, they even found it difficult to conceptualize. So if experienced academics working in the field of art education are finding this term challenging, then no wonder through the education system itself, cognition is becoming difficult to define within our subject area. Another challenge that causes dissonance is our interdisciplinary perspectives and the experiences that we have. They actually complicate our understanding of cognition. This can lead to marginalization of our subject and also of our personal worth as teachers as well. We may feel that our subject isn't worthy, it's not showing enough cognitive depth. So often I hear art educators saying, oh, we have to fight for our subject. We have to always defend the depth of our subjects, the cognitive connections that are occurring, more so perhaps than some of the other curriculum areas. We can actually get lost when we're trying to track our cognition, when we're trying to monitor cognition occurring, and that can create another complexity, and then we stop engaging with it. Okay. A fifth one could actually be the subjective nature of cognition. Because it's so unique and subjective, it's often deemed too complex to engage with. This presents a barrier for the development of policy, practice and research and the worth of the subject, which in a result has an effect on the progression of art education. And the final point in relation to dissonance that I would like to make actually relates to power. How we actually project our views about cognition within our subjects through governments, through policy, whether we do it locally, nationally or globally, through webinars like this, in practice or research, by academics, teachers and students, actually influences how it's perceived and the importance that is actually placed on it within our subject. So I feel that it's actually very important for us to actually open up a conversation about cognition within art education, so that we can start to address some of the barriers that are preventing our subject from having status and actually growing within the education system. Okay, so hand in hand with those complexities, we actually have demonstrating cognition as a very big challenge. So I'm going to take this image of children drawing here to actually exemplify different ways that you can read into this demonstration of cognition. If the children here are just colouring in, then the cognitive connections that they're forming and the depth of these connections might actually be quite low in number or quite limited. And by this, I'm not saying that don't colour in with your children. Children absolutely love colouring in. My children do too. And when I watch them, I see them relax. They engage in quite a therapeutic experience. They might be talking about the colours, the shapes that they're seeing in their drawing. However, if my children only had this experience in their art education, in their weekly art education provision, I would actually be quite concerned because I wouldn't think there's enough depth and opportunity for them to build cognitive connections or deep learning. So by all means, I want colouring to occur, but I also want to see children having a rich, deep experience to build a complex cognitive web to enhance their learning within our subject. However, if we look at this image in a different way, we can actually think about the experience that the children are having, that they may have gone out into the environment around them, they may have taken photographs or video clips of their school environment, they may have come back into the classroom, drawn or projected these onto their piece of paper. They might be thinking about the colours, the textures of the building, they might be talking to their peers, engaging in conversation about what they've seen, recalling their ideas, and actually developing a school environment that they feel happy with, that they would like to see. If that type of activity was happening as opposed to just colouring in, then I would actually feel that the children were engaged in a much deeper cognitive art education experience, because they would be collaborating. They'd be thinking through a medium, through a language, through a context. They'd be engaging in something called transcognition, which Graham Sullivan actually mentions as a theoretical model for cognition. So you can see here that the experience would be much deeper. There'd be much more dialoguing with the world around the children that's actually happening, linking to Gert Biesta's ideas in 2017, that actually a rich art education experience, a rich experience that is cognitive, actually encourages children to dialogue and communicate and make responses to the world that's around them. So why do we need to do this? We need to demonstrate that cognition is important to prevent further marginalisation of our subjects. We need to allow practitioners and learners to actually have a voice, to be heard and to be valued. And we also need to align the subject of art education as equal to other curriculum offerings. And art education doesn't just have to happen on its own to build cognition. Actually, a rich experience for art education would actually be connecting with other subject areas. It's actually a subject that goes on far beyond the classroom. It's a way of living. So after researching for my doctoral study about how artist teachers actually conceptualise and use cognition, and actually engaging with academics in research here at NIE about how we conceptualise cognition, I've actually been able to develop a framework to assist educators with the conceptualisation of cognition in art education, which you can see on the screen here. So cognition, as I've mentioned, is incredibly complex. So it's actually useful for educators to perhaps have a more focused access to think about cognitive forms. So when we're trying to identify cognitive forms, we can think about them in relation to knowledge, process, interdisciplinarity, and also embodiment. So if I just relate that to kind of a more practical example, you can see some pictures of my son at the bottom, and some of his artwork and the experiences that he's been engaged in. And actually through them, he's actually taking knowledge from one area and building it up and kind of putting it into the next area. And he's actually engaging in a cognitive process. The work that he's doing is actually interdisciplinarity, because he's on the right-hand side at the far right image, you can see an experience where he's actually been to the Art Science Museum in Singapore, and he's actually created artwork and put it live into this kind of digital representation of what Singapore is like in a kind of future realm that the Artist Team Lab actually developed. And that's a lovely experience because the children who actually visit this exhibition can be engaged in creating artwork and actually put their artwork live into this moving installation around them. So actually, these are all different unique experiences. Some he's had at home while he's playing, some when he's painting, drawing. But actually, when you put them together like this, almost like in a documentation of a journal, you can actually see how there's quite obvious connections between these different pieces. His interest in transport, the connections that you can see, the road that he's building with his toys, and then linked to the road network that you can see in art education through the Art Science Museum image. So he's actually embodied in this whole experience of art creation and making over a period of time. So we can use these cognitive forms to look at students' artwork and students' art experiences to think about how their cognition actually builds and forms. So in the research that I was doing, I actually found that there were certain things that actually influenced artist teachers particularly to start to think about and engage with their cognition. And these were the acts that they were engaged in, whether it was their teaching experiences, presenting at conferences, and then they were starting to use those acts to form connections and cognitive ideas, translating ideas from one domain to another. Some of those experiences were internal, when they were reflecting on ideas, and others were external experiences, perhaps when they've been to a particular event, they've seen a specific exhibition, and that they start to build their cognitive connections and influence the development of their own cognition through the acts and experiences that they've had. That led me to think about, well, how can we use those rich cognitive experiences and maps that people like artistic teachers are building? How can we actually use them to apply within the educational experience? So with a group of artist teachers, I actually looked at how they engaged in the application of their own cognition. And they actually engaged with clarifying and transforming their ideas. So taking these acts, connections, and experiences and actually using them to transform the artwork that they were making or the teaching that they were engaging in. They used it to understand and connect, to document ideas, and to construct sort of new experiences and new pedagogies that they were going to use in their teaching. So it was actually incredibly complex. So the framework came from working with artist teachers who are going to go on and be our kind of future teachers in school. But equally, you can see that happening at a different level with my son, who's now 5 years old, actually engaging in his own art education experiences. And even at a young age, they can actually be quite diverse, making quite deep cognitive connections. So that's what I would hope for how cognition actually builds in art education in the future. So to give you some more examples of cognition, I want to look at three sets. I want to look at some theoretical examples of cognition, some examples in practice, and some examples in research. So you can see an example here. I've taken two theories about cognition, which you can see in the grey boxes. Cognition involves thinking in a medium, language, and context, and also cognition being an infiltrator to change. I want you to hold those two thoughts in your mind, and I'm going to talk to you about a case study that actually happened, an art education experience when I was engaged in a research project in the UK. And then we're going to come back to those theoretical examples afterwards. So I was engaged in a digital learning across boundaries project with a team of interdisciplinary collaborators who were academics and teachers working in different European countries. And we were thinking about the idea of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths in education, and actually bringing those subjects together in a cohesive way to raise the profile of arts in the STEAM concept. And I went into my art room at the time one day and found loads of old computers had actually been dumped into the art room space. no one had a use for them. So I thought, well, what can we do with these? So we actually invited children from a local school to come in and engage with taking apart the computers and actually transforming them into something new. And they actually created different birds, which you can see on the screen from the computer parts. I involved my student teachers at the time in the experience as well. And then we started to share over a digital blog platform different ideas that could be used for making these different birds. We developed some bird song using coding techniques. We had QR codes so that the children could scan the QR code and their bird that they'd created from these found objects, the old computer materials, could actually start to sing a song. So they were starting to link different subject areas together. They were understanding the science of how computers were constructed and made, the technology behind them, the design of these products, and recreating them into something new through their artwork. The teachers then went back into their home schools and actually ran their own STEM and STEAM projects. And then they shared them back onto a blog that we'd created at the university, so that we had a collaboration of ideas that had been shared through the internet. That actually provided a really rich resource bank and a bank for professional development for the artist teachers who are actually engaged in part of this project. And I'm only literally sharing a snapshot of it here. If you'd like to find out more, then there is a link at the bottom of this slide that you could engage with. But if I go back to those two theories that I mentioned at the start of this slide, cognition involves thinking in a medium, a language, and a context. So in this example case that I've just shared with you, the children and the students and their teachers might be engaging in thinking through the medium that they're using. And that could be the art materials from the computers. It could be the internet that they're using on the blog to share their ideas. They're engaging in language because they're dialoguing with each other. The art is also becoming a voice, so their language. The bird song, the coding became a voice as well, and the blog platform itself. And they're engaged in a context, a collaborative context, together to actually encourage dialogue and hence cognition and learning. This cognition is that they've been developing through this experiences is actually an infiltrator to change. I mentioned that this actually provided professional development for the teachers who are engaged in the project. When they shared all their ideas on the blog, they actually found that they had a repertoire of ideas that they could take forward into their classrooms that other teachers had given them. So actually they were changing their practice in response to other teachers' ideas. So they were actually engaging in cognition as a form of change. So to demonstrate cognition in a different way within practice, we can think more simply about progression and how progression can actually be a form of cognition, and we can scaffold through cognition in order to develop art education. So I've got two examples. It can be quite a linear process. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's some student teachers here who have just visited a local art gallery. They've been looking at the architecture of the gallery, recording it on paper, creating drawings. They then cut out and took their drawings apart and actually developed them into a new drawing, joining their ideas together. They then took that a stage further and developed their artwork by putting it into computer-based apps like Roll World and Be Funky in order to change their representational drawings into a more abstract concept. So they've gone through a linear process of developing cognitive understanding here to move their ideas forward. On the right-hand side of the screen, very simply, you can see a chalk drawing that a young child has produced where they've been using lots of different patterns and repetitions, almost like a doodle, thinking about shapes and repeating those. That has then been transferred into ink, where they've taken one of those shapes and just really played around with quite big fluid movements, but you can still see that shape occurring. And then you can see a transfer into a clay medium. So it could be when you're developing cognition that you're taking a much smaller concept like shape or line or pattern or tone, and you're actually developing that through progression into different mediums of art. And by engaging in those different mediums, you're building your cognitive understanding of that particular concept or term. To provide another example of a way cognition is built in art education can simply be through exposure. We're trying to encourage connectionism. All the examples on the screen here are of 3D sculptural installational models. So there's a range of experiences here that my son's actually been engaged in. He likes to go to robotics where he's building in 3D. He's a very big fan of Lego. I've taken him to the Art Science Museum and different exhibitions within Singapore where he can start to build connections. You can make installations with string to kind of show this web of connections. Lots of children like to engage in kind of free modelling and playing with materials that they found around them in order to create different ideas. So the exposure, the experiences that we have in art education can actually help us to build and develop cognition whilst engaging children in their visual cultural spaces, which Brent Wilson mentioned in 2021, these child-initiated, adult-initiated and collaborative spaces. Another example within higher education, I've put on this screen here an example from my own students who recently were trying to grapple with what creativity means within art education. And I actually engaged with them online through a Miro. And when you're working with Miro, as a program, students can all be based in their own homes or own spaces and actually contribute online to the generation of like a board of ideas. And in this example, I found it quite compelling because I actually felt that I saw live in front of me students actually creating and curating their own cognition. Very quickly, I stepped back from the screen and actually started to film it. And the students were putting ideas together, and I could see these connections building. You can see connections here being made. And often in education, we use this idea of like mind maps, and this happened to be like a virtual mind map. And in essence, that's what cognition is. We're trying to build a range of different connections in order to enhance our learning. And I felt that's what my students were doing here. And we take different roles as the educator in order to facilitate that. So to provide you with some different research-based examples of cognition, I have a current project that's ongoing at the moment where I'm investigating teaching research and practice in relation to cognition in higher degree art education. This is just coming to an end, but it involves 3 different academics where I interviewed them about their understanding of cognition. They made artworks in response to it, and I also got them to recall their past experiences through autoethnographies about cognition. And I asked them the questions that you can see on the screen here. I analysed the data that I'd gathered from these 3 academics in a range of different ways so that I could be sure that I had a quite strong understanding of how they interpreted and used cognition. And that's actually led to the paper in the British Educational Research Journal that I've published, which shares this cognitive framework model that I spoke about with you earlier. When we were engaged in that project, that's where dissonance really came to the fore for me, that there's so many different challenges within cognition that actually cause dissonance. So that led me to write a second paper about how we're actually within art education, when we're talking about cognition, we're grappling with these cognitive dissonance issues. And actually they need to be voiced so that we can understand cognition further. So some of the early findings that actually came out of that project actually related to how cognition was perceived within teaching, research and practice that these academics were engaged in. And they actually, when they spoke about cognition, often they related it to theory. They related it to accepted beliefs in their field within art education. And they also spoke about their kind of personal experiences and personal opinions and how that actually shaped their understanding of cognition. But what was interesting was that they identified that cognition is located in so many different spaces, which really corroborated my idea that cognition is an embodied experience. It's happening all the time. It's always around us. And it's also innate as well. That led to us thinking about where cognition is actually used and where it's exemplified in teaching, research and practice. And one key thing that came out was actually cognition was a form of motivation. It actually provided a glue to the cognitive networks that these academics who were engaged in the project were using. And they were actually using one experience to build into another, to connect to the next, to connect to their teaching, to connect to their research, to connect to their practice, in order to create this web of knowledge and knowing. And it's ongoing. It never stops. We're always going to be building on our cognition because the world around us is changing. So what can this awareness that we're now developing about cognition actually contribute to our courses that we're offering, for example, here at NIE? So I actually identified some challenges and some developments. I felt that students actually needed more power. They needed more opportunity to engage with cognition and start to map their own cognition so they can take ownership of it. And actually they need support in order to do that. It's something that we can learn to do, something that we as educators can enhance our students to look at different ways that they can make connections in their learning. So I've been quite committed to examining and looking at cognition within art education. And I actually feel that we need to offer time, space and environments to project a voice about cognition. And that's going to be quite fundamental in order to make recommendations for change. So you can see me here sitting with an EFNAS cap on my head, which is actually tracking my brain activity when I'm engaged in an online teaching experience about cognition. And I'm in the very early stages at the moment of doing research into how brain activation and cognition actually connect within the field of art education. There's very limited studies in this area, so it's quite a new, exciting development that's happening. And the reason I'm doing this is because art education is being marginalized as a subject within education, and actually we need to raise the cognitive worth of the subject. So I want to actually narrow the gap between art and science and actually engage with the neuroscience of art education. So that's actually led me into a second research project that I'm about to embark on now, exploring art education and neuroscience and the cognitive exchange that happens within face-to-face, blended, and online experiences of art education. So I'm actually quite fortunate. I'm going to be engaging with new EFNAS technology. The EFNAS technology to track brain activity has actually become much more portable now. So we can actually take this into classrooms and actually wear EFNAS caps in order to see how brain activity occurs in real life art education scenarios. So you can see the project that I'm going to engage with on the screen here. It's quite significant to research because it's hopefully going to enhance our knowledge about the relationship between art education and neuroscience. It's going to enhance an understanding of cognitive knowledge exchange within art education and the pedagogy of art education. It's actually contributing to Singapore's commitment to the study of the science of learning in order to influence policy, practice and research in future. And it's one of the first studies to use portable ethnos devices within art education as a field. So, what can I recommend at this point to support the reinstatement of cognition in art education? So actually based on all the research that I've done, I'd like actually to think about how we can accept cognition, the importance of it and the use of it in art education. So before I speak about very specific things about what we can do in policy, practice and research, I'd like to mention that mobilization is extremely important to the reinstatement of cognition. If forms of cognition are shown in our subject, then the facets that influence cognition are recognized, and applications of cognition can then be used and acknowledged within our subject. That then gives them value. So we need to collaborate, we need to connect, we need to dialogue about cognition so that we have a strong voice, so that we can learn from each other. So in practice, I recommend that we need to have an encouragement of the use of strategies and to give educators strategies to learn and map their cognitive connections in art education. So we need to encourage people to consider the self as a cognitive curator and actually support them to take pedagogic risks and reflect on the cognitive decisions and actions that have occurred in the new pedagogies within art education that they're using. We also need to have increased opportunities to actually study cognition, particularly within art education training, whether that's teacher training or professional development. Within policy, we need to reconsider the way cognition is viewed and valued beyond its identity as an academic performance measure. We need to think about effective and embodied notions of cognition because they're actually often discredited within policy. So we need to sort of mobilize their worth. We should consider the contribution of empirical, small-scale and institution-specific research in art education as well. Often that type of research is put to one side when policy is being developed, but actually that type of research is incredibly important to the development of art education as a research area. And actually we need to value this direction of research in the arts. In the arts, we used a range of different types of research methods, and actually we need to mobilize those within policy in order to increase the worth of our cognitive endeavor. In research specifically, we need to have some more ongoing research to make cognitive knowledge maps accessible, and these need to happen now, not just in physical but virtual domains as well. We need more empirical studies in art education about cognition, and we need to consider how different brain-orientated teaching models actually apply within our subject area. So there's actually a lot of work for us to do in the future within the realm of cognition. But I know there's many dedicated teachers out there who are already providing really lovely art education experiences for their students that have real cognitive depth. So it will be good to draw on those examples and to look at policy, practice and research and how that can develop in relation to cognition in our field. Okay, thank you very much to everybody for listening today. I've put a range of references that I've referred to today in today's presentations onto these slides for you, and also some useful reading if you're interested in any of the areas that I've spoken about today. There's some extra reading that you might like to access here. So thank you everybody for listening. Let's open up the discussion and questions. And whilst we're doing that, please feel free to contribute your cognition drawing that I asked you to create as you're going through this webinar to the Padlet that's on the screen now. Just take a photograph of it so you've got access to it, and then you can upload your contribution at your leisure.
Thank you, Rebecca. We've come to the question and answer segment. I do understand it's about 8 p.m. and the webinar was advertised to run from 7 to 8. but I thought it's useful to extend it a little bit and to allow the audience to ask questions. So if I can take the liberty to ask the first question. Because a lot of the audience today are teachers, and this idea of visible thinking and visible thinking routines is something that we use a lot in our schools. So I was wondering, how does Harvard Project Zero's visible thinking project, um, the thinking routines and so on, that make thinking visible, how does it connect with the theories or the models about cognition that you have cited in your presentation?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to the presentation. Okay, to answer that question, I think it's a brilliant question to raise about the Harvard Project Zero thinking routines. The Harvard Project thinking routines are actually fundamentally highly connected to cognition. Cognition is a form of thinking about thinking, and the Harvard Project thinking routines encourage us to do that. When they're used particularly within primary education, as we sort of move through the thinking routines, such as things like See, Think, Wonder, we can see how students can actually start to build on their thinking and connect ideas together. However, although I think they're very useful and they're a great starting point for thinking about cognition, I think cognition actually goes a stage further, because cognition is actually about connecting kind of multiple facets together. So when I've seen students in school actually using the Harvard Project thinking routines, that they use them very well initially, but I do worry that sometimes as we sort of move through different age groups, that the thinking routines become repeated, which is good, but they don't necessarily actually have a depth in terms of cognitive understanding. So they're not always built upon, which actually when we're trying to create cognition, when we're curating, we're trying to connect ideas together, but also to create depth in those ideas. So See, Think, Wonder is a useful aspect within cognitive curation, and it's a useful aspect in relation to thinking about thinking within art education, and cognition is actually well connected and actually built on those routines, but cognitive curation, as I've been speaking about in this presentation, actually goes a stage further. So for me, they're a useful starting point, and I do advocate the use of them, but they provide a strategy to think about cognition. In a way, they're another model, a bit like the studio habits of mind that I spoke about. So actually what we need to do is actually use all of those entities together to get a really deep and rich cognitive experience within art education.
So you raised a good point about how the Harvard thinking, visible thinking routines could be, I guess, an entry point to get things started. But the crux of it will be, well, from one of the quotes you cited is this idea of how it needs to be situated in a medium, a language, and context, and then it should continue to grow. Things like connectionism, those are things that came to mind. And I'm just looking through the chat, and I want to thank Eugene. I think it's Eugene that's been posting furiously to make use of the chat as a back channel chat as well, to kind of help weave and to provoke the thinking of the audience. So Eugene actually wrote, See, Think, Wonder is flawed. It should be See connecting with prior experience and encounters. So I think that's a really valid point. And he goes on to say that we should ask about the depth of ideas, how every participant, however young, has the intuition or intuitive depth of immersion. So thank you, Eugene.
And I think our role as educators is that as we move through the education system, that this kind of connection of ideas needs to be gaining depth, it needs to be gaining traction, we need to be giving more ownership to the person that's involved in it, so that we see that when we move from, say, an early years primary setting right up to a higher degree setting where we're training teachers to think about cognition, that actually through that process you gain much more autonomy. Children, of course, have autonomy in their own cognitive connections, but if we truly want to add that depth and criticality there, then we need to provide strategies and support in order to be able to do that. So things have to get deeper as we move through the education system.
Yes, and I'm also wondering whether or not the connections need to be made by the learner, not the teacher making the connections for the students and then the students memorizing it.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's about autonomy and taking ownership and kind of scaffolding that process.
Right. Okay. Paul Lincoln actually has a question. He says, could I revisit something? I think you have mentioned about how these cognitive activities have an impact on the larger cognitive development of a person. So I think you used the word glue. So he's wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so as we start to build our cognition, I mentioned earlier that cognition is embodied, that it involves different contexts. I think it was mentioned in the chat that sometimes like this happens just as we're walking down the street, we're building these ideas together. So the cognition that we're building within art education is then transferable to other domains, and equally from other domains back to art education. And so we can't see art education just as this closed entity that happens in this traditional school classroom. It actually goes much further beyond that, and we need to give students and learners and those people engaging in art education the opportunity to filter those in to the practice that they're happening. And that's why it's important that art education just doesn't always take place in a very traditional way. We need to be out there in the galleries, we need to be taking the children to parks, making art in different locations in order to provide them with a really kind of rich opportunity to actually build the connections with us, but also for themselves as well.
I'm actually going to pick up a strand that Eugene planted a while ago. He cited Newton's third law, E-motion. So the question I thought that we could then pose is, how do we actually situate emotions or the affect in learning in this whole cognitive discussion that we're having? Does it fall under the embodiment, or is it really just part of cognition anyway, because it's in the brain? Yeah,
I think it depends how you conceptualize cognition in the first place, because for me cognition is embodiment, and with embodiment that also encompasses affect, emotion, our context around us, our collaborations we have with other people, our feelings. But if we don't view cognition in that way, and we kind of lean perhaps towards a more scientific or a brain orientated sort of view of cognition, where we don't value that affective embodied experience, then that can actually be quite dangerous. And I think that's what's happened in policy, certainly in UK policy anyway, previously, that the cognitive nature of art from the outset has been viewed in quite a closed way, and then that has sort of filtered down into the policy within art education. And what actually needs to happen is we need to backtrack and unpick how we actually view cognition in the first place. And actually, if we think about it in embodied, affective, emotional ways, and that's how we're defining cognition, and everybody has an understanding of that, which I hope is what my framework tries to encourage, then actually when we filter back into policy and practice, it's accepted from the outset that cognition is an embodied experience, is an affective experience.
And that kind of connects with this necessity for thinking about wellness in this current COVID-19 situation, and the role the arts play. Not talking about art therapy or art therapy like exercises, but really the cognitive effects, not just the emotive effects that the arts can bring.
And definitely, I think that connects to what I was talking about in relation to dissonance today. That actually the pandemic itself is kind of throwing so much dissonance out there in terms of how we live our lives, how we feel in terms of our wellness, how we feel emotionally. People are turning to the arts in order to kind of cope and deal with sort of pandemic pressures. And that's going to filter and change the education system as well. So I think we need to think about how dissonance is coming across within art education, and actually valuing that this dissonance can include sort of wellness issues, therapeutic issues. But we don't have to look at it through art therapy. That is a real factor within art education today, that students might actually be starting to bring this more into the classroom, knowingly and unknowingly, through their responses that they're having in the artwork. And it might be quite a real issue that art educators actually face now, when students are producing their work, that they will start to filter these dissonance issues into the artwork that they're making. And then we as educators need to be responding to that, or talking or engaging in dialogue about it.
Right.
And it's quite a scary place, I think, actually, for an educator to enter, when students start to bring up dissonance issues within the art classroom.
And I guess as teachers, it's always important to acknowledge that the dissonance exists rather than brush it off. I'm going to read a comment from Jean, followed by a question from Jess. So Jean says, regarding creating depth for students, some curricula such as the IB Diploma in Art is a very useful and direct way to achieve this. It has 3 components: exhibition, process portfolio, where candidates document their works from ideation to completion of each work, and of course the comparative study, where 3 artworks, at least 2 artists from different backgrounds are compared. So related to this, would you say that there is a way to conceptualize how cognition can be assessed more effectively? For example, from the example that I've just read out, is there a way to assess it in a formative way? For example, using the studio habits of mind, versus something that's really exam board, what the exam boards want to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complicated issue when you start to bring in assessments, because obviously you can only assess a certain number of things. So if you were looking into cognition, then it may be that you were taking different theoretical models, applying them to inquiry-based learning or the International Baccalaureate, for example, and you would still be assessing against a set of criteria within whichever theory that you chose to connect to in relation to cognition. But cognition goes further than that, and in a similar way to can art even be assessed? Like we debate that question quite frequently within art education. And yes, within certain models, we have to have assessment protocols in place to fit policy that's there, but also we also have at the back of our minds often as art educators, is assessment purposeful? Why are we doing assessments? How are we doing our assessment? So in a way we need to try and kind of find a best fit model. So it could be that we take different theoretical models for cognition, and we look at how those theoretical models are kind of woven through the education system that we have, and we connect to those at different points, and perhaps we have deeper models as students kind of age or become more experienced with the art education that they have. So I think it's a very interesting question that opens up a lot of different directions, and it really comes down to 1, how you view assessment in art education, 2, how you view cognition, because it's incredibly complex, and you open up so many different theories when you start to talk about cognition, and then you put 2 very broad areas together like that, and actually that creates dissonance in itself. So I think it's always going to be a problematic area within our field of art education.
probably as problematic as should art even be assessed in the first place.
Yes.
I'm going to pick up a question from Sharon, who posted something in the chat. She would like to ask, how can we encourage our students to be more open and willing to share their thoughts as dialogue? As dialogue is such an important component in cognitive development, how can we encourage and engage in a more in-depth or in-department dialogue? And I guess I want to also connect this with Eugene's post earlier, this idea about, and also to your presentation, you mentioned this idea about spaces, a child-initiated space, adult-initiated space, collaborative space. So might the answer be kind of there? And Eugene mentioned this pretty interesting a play with words, this idea of habit and habitats, which also relates to space and also routines and all that. So how would you what could you advise or give tips on how can we help students engage in a more in-depth dialogue?
Sure, I think it's a really lovely question, actually, and something I actually revisit and ask myself quite a lot. And for me, it actually comes down to ethos that you're creating within your classroom, and whether you're projecting an environment that's very open to dialogue and discussion, that there's a safe place in order for children to voice their concerns through their artwork. In different ways. I saw a lovely example within a Singaporean classroom recently, where one of our the students, teachers from NIE, actually got the 16-year-old learners within the classroom, and the teacher actually used a virtual space in order to get the children to collaborate and share their ideas. Because the children in the room weren't opening up so much in their dialogue verbally. But when they did that through a virtual space, we saw this kind of beautiful kind of capture of loads of lovely ideas and dialogue going on within a virtual space in a real life classroom. So it was a really nice sort of blended experience for the students, and actually created a really rich dialogue. And for me, that hit home because it reminded me that students now are experiencing different types of spaces to what I used to experience in art education when I was going through the education system. And actually, the virtual world now is much more prevalent to students. So if we can kind of create an ethos where we can use the virtual with the face-to-face, with this wider habitat, then actually we can create a really rich space for dialoguing. And it's actually coming back down to the teacher and their teaching team and the policy that's implemented to actually embrace this ethos. And it's quite a risk in order to do, because as we open up sort of educational settings, and then there's lots of external factors like safeguarding and things that come into play. So it's a brave step forward for education, but we need to be moving in that sort of direction.
Right. So picking on the keyword safe learning, I think Jean also suggested that it could be a matter of tweaking existing structures or learning activities in the classroom. For example, calling an activity sharing rather than presentation, formal presentation, making the activity start in pairs, in small groups, rather than one person to the whole class, would be a ways in which we could make baby steps to invite students to share ideas before they can engage in richer dialogue. And to add to that, I thought it's also useful to mention that since Rebecca, you mentioned this idea of using virtual space as well. I think thinking about virtual space also requires us to think about this idea of trust, both online and also in person. And I think most teachers will probably agree that it's probably easier to build trust in person first before launching on something that's very elaborate or having very in-depth dialogues virtually online. Because if trust can be built in person, bringing that conversation to a virtual space will probably be easier.
Yeah, and these can, I really love the fact that somebody mentions kind of micro things that you can do in your classroom, because they're the sort of realistic day-to-day things that can happen. And we can look at sort of macro things like this discussion in virtual spaces, but you can actually bring that right down to a micro level within your classroom. So it could just be simply having a class Padlet that's set up, that's very kind of safe space just for that class. Only the people within that room can contribute to it. And it could be just sharing with it within that small space together. So micro acts that people engage in relation to building cognition and generating classroom ethos will actually build into a kind of macro picture in the end. And so it's important that we make these little steps. So I'm really glad that somebody picked up on that. Thank you.
All right. I'm also going to paraphrase a question or a comment from Renee Lee in the chat. She says that the challenge for her is how do we inform primary students that what they have done is cognition? How do we help them identify with it? Then, of course, to add to that question is how do we explain it in simple terms to students, to parents, and to school leaders of with this cognition perspective or cognition slant to explain the value of art?
Yeah, and I think this is about making it age appropriate. So if we take the Harvard Project Zero examples, the artful thinking routines, what they do very well is actually bring it down to a language that is accessible for children. And that's what we need to do within cognition. Like if you show children a picture of somebody with an ethnos cap on, some children will get very excited by it and be open up to discussion about what's happening inside the brain and what's going on. And at that point, when the children are kind of excited about it, we can start to think about, well, we're actually trying to make connections. And even very young children can start to think about the concept of building connections. How did you use an idea from one project and use it into the next? Is there something that you took from your maths lesson that you've now applied into your art lesson? It could be through photography that we would start to record this. It could be through voice capturing in a lesson when you're having a conversation with a student. So there's lots of different ways that we can start to encourage this dialogue around cognition. And it doesn't mean that we have to go straight in with the literature about neuroscience and the different models of cognition that are there. That might be appropriate with your master teachers or your master students at university level. But for a child in the classroom, just talking about the connections that they're making within their learning and opening that space for dialogue can actually be enough.
And to add to that, maybe it's also important to talk about neuroplasticity in simple terms, that your mind continues to grow as you grow up, and learning doesn't stop. So maybe that's important to give emphasis to in primary schools as well. Okay, I'm gonna see if there are any other questions from the chat. I'm gonna ask a fun question. And the fun question I thought we could pose is there value in art making that is without thinking? I'm thinking of Dada's anti-art or Dadaist poem or surrealist automatism that sometimes we bring to our art classrooms to try out.
Yeah, so can art making actually occur without thinking? I think that we can be engaged in a point of flow when we're engaged in an art making process. Like we might just be autonomously responding, we might hear something around us, we might start to paint, we might get kind of lost in that painting, and we come into a sense of flow where we're just kind of happy and at ease with what's happening. And then quite often I like to refer to these as sort of happy accidents within my artwork. I didn't really know where I was going with it, but it sort of evolved and developed through this sort of contentment of being in that kind of making space. But I think that isn't separate from actually cognitive development and thinking. So although it might seem like we're in a space where we're kind of pausing, we're in the moment, we're in a state of flow, I think what our brain is actually doing at that point is still building connections, and it may be in our unconscious that these connections are sort of generating and evolving, rather than it kind of being a state of pause. So in neuroscience research in relation to art making, we already know that when we're engaged in the making experience, every aspect of our brain is actually activated. So these cognitive connections that are occurring are really highly charged and highly developed, and are kind of activated all the time. But we may be feeling a sense of contentment and flow, happiness, of kind of being in the experience. So I don't think there is an art making without cognition, but it can manifest differently, sort of within that process.
Right. So it's a bit like if we put an MRI, the brain lights up. So
Yes.
there is some thinking. And I guess thinking also comes in when we start to talk about what we have just made. You know, when we start to bring meaning into the activity, or even rejecting meaning would require some kind of a thought as well. I'm just going to read out a comment, a fun comment from Sherilyn from the chat. She says that a question that she often gets from her students is, "Can art make me smarter?" So how would you advise a teacher respond to questions like that? Can
Will
art
it
make
make
me
me
smarter?
smarter? No, I don't think it necessarily makes you smarter. I think it gives you a place to trial ideas, to connect things together. It can even be a space to kind of relax your mind, to build connections. And I think it's actually in taking that time and that space and being engaged in the art making process, it might appear that we become smarter. So actually a lot of brain surgeons, for example, actually also engage in things like music and art making, and are actually really highly proficient in those areas. Because they have this space in order to kind of come back to kind of more playful entities within their creative processes. So I think, does it make you smarter? I'm not entirely sure about the answer to that. But if a student were to ask me if art making made them smarter, I think I would say, try and engage with it. What does it do for you? And trying to get them to sort of unpick the process. And if they don't like drawing, for example, try making with clay. That doesn't work for them. Try another art making experience. And just kind of question them and engage them to think about, well, what can it actually do for you? Did it help you? It might not have helped you in being smarter in terms of mathematical development, but it might have relaxed the student or made them see the world differently, or which in essence could be making them smarter. Yes.
Right. Building on that, to Sherilyn, you could also say, that's a smart question, and
It
back
is,
to you,
yes.
and to ask back the student, or to say to the student that art can make you smarter if you want it to.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
that could be a simple way of bringing that question to this idea of ownership as well. Okay, let's see. Okay, there are a couple of comments in the chat. I don't think we have time to read all of it. So I'm gonna bring ourselves to the last question. I just want to check if anyone has any last questions. If not, I'm gonna ask Rebecca a last question to hopefully try to round up the webinar for today. So I think you mentioned that art is marginalized around the world. So the research on art and cognition may help us substantiate the value of art teaching and learning, so that it remains to be supported in Singapore, if not given more support. So what advice will you give to teachers in 4 sentences? For example, in Singapore schools, we often use this acronym, KEEP, improve, stop, start. Could you give us 4 sentences to as a way of giving some advice that or tips that teachers could bear in mind?
Absolutely, this is quite a fun question. Okay, so in terms of, I would say, keep taking risks, keep challenging yourself, and try and go sort of deeper with your practice. Try different things, perhaps go outside the box with the pedagogy that you're using, and yes, basically keep taking those risks in order to view cognition differently. Okay. In terms of improve, I would say improve your defense for the cognitive value of your subject. so that we can start to counteract this marginalization of arts education. I would say stop being afraid or stop worrying. It's okay to be vulnerable sometimes. Think, well, what's the worst that can happen if you do enter this space of trying something new? And also start feeling proud of what you do. You're all working within the arts sector, which is incredibly important. Art is highly cognitive. Hopefully I've convinced some of you today with some of the models that I've shared. And our challenge actually as educators is showing that. And it's not going to happen overnight. This is something that we've got to collaborate together and work towards and really kind of voice the profile, the importance of cognition within our subject. Okay.
Thank you so much for replying to the question and for giving us 4 quick tips. We've come to the end of today's webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the NIE CARE website, and the CARE website is care.nie.edu.sg. And I also want to mention that the past recordings of all CARE forums and webinars can be accessed from the events tab. So last but not least, on behalf of NIE CARE, thank you once again for attending the webinar this evening. Wishing you all a pleasant evening. Stay safe and farewell.